And then on the flip side, being on the other side of the table, sometimes you have these super talented junior folks, and I know they know the answer, and I know they have valuable input, but they're just kind of afraid or don't step up. And so it's kind of, I think it's also important as you kind of get up there to encourage or facilitate or even pre-stage opportunities for folks to chime in. It's like, hey, look, I know we're going to be talking about these financial numbers. I can certainly speak to them, but I'm going to actually, when we get to this, I'm going to ask you the question to just be prepared. And you do that once, and then what happens is now later on in the meeting, when there's something else that's valuable that you maybe didn't plan, that person now has the confidence to speak up, and it's a valuable input. I've actually had a lot more success with. Yeah, I consider myself kind of a little bit of an unpolished rock, right? Where um, and I've had a lot more success with super talented, smart folks that maybe don't have that polish than someone that has an amazing resume and has been at all these different great places and maybe super polished, but might not have the content underneath it. And so it's how do you get, but without the polish or without the thing, you don't get what you need out of them, right? And so it's almost by necessity where, okay, I have this super smart person, I know they know everything, but they're not contributing to the level. Or maybe they're contributing when it's just me and them, but in a broader meeting, they sit quiet or they're not engaged. And that doesn't help, right? And so kind of you end up with this one-on-one structure, but a team that doesn't work. And so it really came out of that necessity where you've got super smart folks around a table that you need to figure out a way to facilitate a better outcome as a team. And so it's how do you do that? And how do you put people in a position to demonstrate not just to yourself, but to others that they're capable and smart and trustworthy. And then once that barrier is broken down, now the team functions better.
Are you ready to learn how to grow your entrepreneurial mindset so that you can not just survive, but thrive now and into the future? This is your show. Welcome to PossibLaw. Let's get into it. I'm excited to learn from today's guest. Peter has done it all: corporate consulting, private equity, growing multiple e-commerce platforms, and most recently joining the board of publicly traded pet meds. He also happens to be one of the kindest humans you will ever meet. Welcome, Peter.
Hey, Sal. Thanks for having me on.
I think today, based on how long we've known each other, is going to be really interesting since I know you pretty well. But our audience doesn't. And so one of the ways I love to start these is to help the people listening get to know you as a person beyond the professional. So I like to ask, what do you like to do when you're not working?
Other than our fantasy football league that we're in together for many decades, a variety of interests. It's it's me and my wife. We don't have any kids, so we're kind of free. So we love to travel, leverage the flexibility that gives us to different places. Recently, I've gotten super into paddle, still trying to figure out how to pronounce it. So I've been playing multiple times a week. Like to stay active. Anything that gets me outside is always amazing. So just really kind of try to take myself away from any professional things and really things that kind of switch my brain off and allow me to focus on non-work related things.
I think I've learned in stressful jobs, if you don't have anything that is a release, you end up being in a bad place. And so finding things that you enjoy is really important. How did you get into paddle? I think it's paddle, but we're just going to go with paddle for right now.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. If I look at my kind of up moments and down moments, kind of when in situations where all you're doing is working and nothing else, even if it's super productive and super valuable work, you find at the end of the day you're drained and don't feel fulfilled. Versus in times where you've kind of got the right balance, even if it's challenging times at work, right? You kind of have the motivation and energy to kind of keep going at it. Paddle. So I'm from Miami, or live in Miami now, and it's taken off in Miami. So everyone's kind of playing it, and just learning something new, learning a new skill is always kind of just reboots your system in one way or another. So about a year and a half ago, a couple of friends who had just also tried it for the first time. We got together, and it's pretty addictive. So if you haven't tried it, I highly recommend it.
I've done paddle once. I was in Austin last year starting another venture, and in Austin, pickleball is insane. And so all the like potential founders I was talking with were all like, "Oh, we got to go to this place and do that." And so I've done pickleball a little bit. It's fun. I will say that I think the thing I like about it is, as I've gotten older, it's like athletic, but it's not. You're not going to necessarily kill yourself, and so that's pretty fun.
Yeah, it's interesting. In Miami, it's definitely become a little bit of a professional networking thing too, where before it's just play with friends, and now it's rather than have coffee, hey, let's play paddle, and then grab lunch or breakfast or something afterwards and talk business. So it's interesting to see how that has started to become more of a networking thing as well.
I've always thought I enjoy meeting people, right? Like you do too. Like we like talking to people and having a good time generally. And I think as you're younger in your career, you're told all the time, like you got to network, you got to meet people, you never know where it's going to take you. But it's a little hard, especially if you're a little bit introverted in how you engage with people. And I do love that we've started to get this culture where it's not quite so much about going out to the bars until 3 a.m. and it's something more athletic and people can enjoy and participate in. Do you think having a network that you can rely on has helped you to get where you are?
So it's interesting. I've met plenty of folks in my life who are natural networkers, right? And they know everyone and they're totally comfortable in a new scenario, working the room. When I think of myself, I hate networking, right? It's kind of the concept of going to a conference where you don't know anyone and figuring out who's who. But then when I talk to others, and they're like, "What do you mean? You're like the best networker I know." I'm like, "Well, I don't network. I don't do networking," and it's really a lot more organic, right? So on the one hand, a lot of people think of networking as just showing up to a place where you don't know anyone. Where really, if there's a shared interest or a shared cause, and it's kind of just again more organic. You're not going there strictly to meet random folks that you don't have a lot of overlap with, and you're really kind of going there for a purpose. I found these things happen naturally. And then further to your point, it's crazy. You never know how a connection that maybe is just completely random and seems of no significance at the time, years, decades later, comes to fruition. And as we kind of get into some more stuff, I think half of my journey has been one connection somehow leading to another, and next thing you know, it evolves. So definitely, I think being cognizant of your network is important. Even if you don't think that you're a great networker, I think you can surprise yourself just by being your true, authentic self, building relationships that are actually enjoyable and meaningful, not just for the purpose of getting something out of them. And then you never know how many years later something, someone, somewhere evolves and actually helps you from a career and professional perspective when you never actually intended it to.
I think what I heard out of that is provide value without a transactional need, sort of. At the end of the day, if people find you authentic and you're just genuinely interested in what they do and helping them, they're going to remember that way more than they're going to remember hey, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. And that ends up not helping you in the long run. So I think it's really good advice. How did you get comfortable in your own skin? How did you find your authentic self?
Yeah, it's interesting. As you get older, you definitely start to be more comfortable in your own skin. So I think a lot of times when you're younger, you kind of feel like an imposter, or you feel that you're overstepping, or, to use a football analogy, out kicking your coverage. And then as you get older, for one reason or another, having been in enough experiences, you almost sometimes tilt to the other side where you become overly confident and very comfortable with making decisions or statements that maybe are premature, you don't have all the information. And so I kind of, having experienced both sides of that, I think when you're kind of not comfortable in your own skin, you overcompensate where you actually are qualified and your opinions do matter, but you're too scared to kind of say them. And then as you've had a couple of things that have gone right, I think it's important to be cognizant, and just because you've had things go well in some areas doesn't mean that it's just a guarantee and every decision you make is going to be the right one. And so kind of just making sure that you kind of take a step back and evaluate things. So really, I think it's just about reps and experience and kind of being in a position where you had a thought and you didn't say it. And then maybe later you're like, oh, that thought was the right thought. And that actually was correct. And I should have said it. And you have a couple of those things. And then all of a sudden you start to build that comfort in your own skin, as you would say.
I think there's a bunch of like pieces I want to pull out of there that I think are really interesting. One is when you're a junior professional, when you're starting your career or you're younger in a profession, you get imposter syndrome because you just don't know what you don't know. And you don't realize that you need to speak up even when you don't necessarily know, right? And so how did you gain the confidence to, when you're in that room and somebody says something, you're like, I don't think that's right, or I have this idea. How did you get the confidence to talk when you did have a little bit of that imposter syndrome of, should I even be here?
Yeah. If you were to talk to some of the folks that worked with me for me, they'll often say that, yeah, I don't have a filter, but which sometimes is a negative. But if a lot of times you're in a meeting and there'll be something humorous or an ability for something humorous, and I, I can't pass up an opportunity for a joke or whatnot. And so even at an early career, I remember when I'd be in private equity and I'd be in these board meetings as a junior person where really your job is there is to take notes, right? You're not there to speak, but there'd be an opportunity to say something funny or even just interject. I just couldn't help it and would say something, and even something as small as that. Yeah, of course, you got to make sure it's appropriate, but even something as small as that is appreciated. And all of a sudden now the folks at the table look at you a little different. And then it also kind of breaks the ice for yourself, right? And then when there is a business point, you all of a sudden, it's not just who's this person and why are they saying anything. You're comfortable in kind of stepping in. And then on the flip side, being on the other side of the table, sometimes you have these super talented junior folks, and I know they know the answer, and I know they have valuable input, but they're just kind of afraid or don't step up. And so it's kind of, I think it's also important as you kind of get up there to encourage or facilitate or even pre-stage opportunities for folks to chime in. It's like, hey, look, I know we're going to be talking about these financial numbers. I can certainly speak to them, but I'm going to actually, when we get to this, I'm going to ask you the question, to just be prepared. And you do that once, and then what happens is now later on in the meeting, when there's something else that's valuable that you maybe didn't plan, that person now has the confidence to speak up, and it's a valuable input. So I think for me as a junior person, comedy, is certainly a way to break down those initial barriers. And then as I've grown, I've always tried to facilitate and support, other folks for speaking up.
I love the idea of pre-stage or pre-facilitate the growth of the people that work for you or work around you. I think great leaders, their responsibility is frankly not to manage or do their job. It's to grow the people around them. I think great teams are really what drive innovation and real growth. And so I love finding and talking to people who think about that as part of their job. How did you come to that conclusion? It was just organic over time that you realized, it's part of my responsibility as a leader to grow people? Or was that something a mentor gave you advice on? Where'd you come up with that?
I think it's trial and error, right? I've actually had a lot more success with, I consider myself kind of a little bit of an unpolished rock, right? Where, um, and I've had a lot more success with super talented, smart folks that maybe don't have that polish than someone that has an amazing resume and has been at all these different great places and maybe super polished, but might not have the content underneath it. And so it's how do you how do you get, but without the polish or without the thing, you don't get, you don't get what you need out of them, right? And so it's almost by necessity where, okay, I have the super smart person. I know they know everything, but they're not contributing to the level. Or maybe they're contributing when it's just me and them, but in a broader meeting, they sit quiet or they're not engaged. And that doesn't help, right? And so kind of you end up with this one-on-one structure, but a team that doesn't work. And so it really came out of that necessity where you've got super smart folks around a table that you need to figure out a way to facilitate a better outcome as a team. And so it's how do you do that? And how do you put people in a position to demonstrate not just to yourself, but to others that they're capable and smart and trustworthy. And then once that barrier is broken down, now the team functions better.
And I think that's a critical piece of this that I think a lot of times people forget, which is if everybody is working at their best version of themselves, the team just works better and you get better results. And so helping grow that team is as important as anything. How did you come to leadership roles in your career? Let's talk a little bit about, how you got where you got. So what'd you go to college for instance?
Good question.
You remember?
No, I went to college, to be a stockbroker, right? I still remember this. I remember the stockbroker coming to my parents' house, sitting around the kitchen table and just me poking my head and listening to the conversation. And so to me, I was always good at math. And so to me, that was always the career that I thought that I would have. So when I went to college, I knew I wanted to be finance focused and finance major. Certainly didn't have the corporate finance mindset going in, but so yeah, college was always math and finance focused.
Well, you also graduated early, graduated early, right?
Yeah. Again, I don't have many regrets. Maybe that might be one regret, but I went to Temple University in Philadelphia, and had done well in high school and had some AP credits, and just was meeting with my guidance counselor, and they were putting out the agenda, and they're like, oh well, if you take an extra class here or there, you could actually be done with all your requirements in 3 years instead of 4. In hindsight, the correct decision would have been to do a study abroad for the 4th year, but I think I've overcompensated for that later in life by doing my fair share of travel abroad.
I asked because I've had multiple people on the podcast who happen to have graduated college early, and to a T, they're all like, "Yeah, that was the wrong decision. I should have spent more time enjoying myself, learning something new, studying abroad, something, right, versus just like getting out." And I was curious how you felt about it. So it's not surprising to hear that. Once you were done with college and the stockbroker opportunity, what happened with that?
Yeah, I think shortly after understanding more about what a stockbroker, a financial advisor, a wealth manager does, that's a lot more of a sales, people, relationship management than it is core finance analytics. So early on in my college career had pivoted toward more on the corporate finance side. Had gotten an internship. Well, actually taking a step back, right? Kind of starting down the whole networking path, right? So in college, one of my best friends was really close with one of the professors. I didn't think anything of it. I wasn't trying to win favor with the professor. It was just a great professor, super interesting. I also became close with the professor and had a relationship. And sure enough, that professor was involved with the career development side of the opportunity, knew General Electric, which was one of the better jobs to have out of Temple. Well, and so that professor is the one that guided me toward, hey, Peter, you should be talking to the General Electric folks. Let me put a good recommendations in for you. And that's what facilitated my first job out of college. So once again, I wasn't going to that professor because I knew they were the gatekeeper for this great internship. It was just natural, organic, being your authentic self with them. And then sure enough, that, was very valuable to me when it came time to get in that first job out of college.
What was the GE experience like for you? I I think there's a long history of people who've gone through the GE cycle, the earlier version of GE, not necessarily the current version of GE. But how was that for you?
Yeah, so it was my first kind of taste of humility, I would say, because, had always done well in high school, had gotten good grades in college, always prided myself on being, one of the, at least in the top tier or whatever it was, whether it's grades or whatnot. And GE, this is their financial management program, kind of their keystone entry 2-year rotational program. Everyone was smart, right? They're all good. And I was definitely middle of the pack, right? And so it was kind of interesting, right? Where throughout my educational career, I was certainly used to being top of the, in the top tier. Here, I was definitely in the middle, and so really made me kind of start to better understand where my skill sets were, where other people's skill sets were, and kind of where I needed to grow and develop. But it was also, by the way, it was also super fun. Every 2 years, moving to a different city, every 6 months for 2 years, moving to a different city, kind of being thrown in with minimal folks that you knew and having to go out there on a limb and build new relationships with different folks. So it was definitely a big part of my early development, kind of post college life that definitely influenced me. And I learned a ton about just myself and being out on my own in those first couple of years.
I've heard you said earlier this idea of focusing on being adaptable and growing and learning and improving yourself. And I don't think you get where you've gotten in your career without a lot of that, especially with kind of the industry change or career change and stuff. But where did that come from? Is that something you learned from your parents, from a mentor? Did it just get instilled in you at birth? Were you that kid, or where did that come from?
No, it's interesting. My parents, immigrated from Moldova to the U.S. when I was a young kid, and they took a huge risk in doing that. If you think back on it, and when I've talked to other kind of immigrants, they've had a similar thing where on the one hand the parents took a huge risk, but then it's like, what, they used up all of their risk capital in their life by doing that, and then everything else needs to be zero risk, right? So my parents are actually the opposite, zero entrepreneurship, just get a job. Why can't you just get a normal job like everyone else? Why, so it's been interesting as my entrepreneurial side of my career has developed. They've always just been like, man, if you could just have a normal, nice salary job, it would be so nice. So it was actually kind of the opposite of what my parents would guide me. It's just been really curiosity, right? I think that I'm not an entrepreneur in the typical sense where I'm an idea guy, shoot from the hip. I've met plenty of those and they're super impressive. I'm very much a quantitative, step-by-step, process-driven type of person. And so, my entrepreneurial journey and kind of adapting and learning new things has just been situational, as we've kind of discussed. You're at GE, you learn some things, you get exposed to some new things and kind of just being curious. Okay, well, I wonder what this is, or I wonder what this is, and kind of, you build a lot of great relationships with, your coworkers who you're just building those relationships just to enjoy each other's company. But then all of a sudden someone goes somewhere and does something new. And now all of a sudden, oh, tell me about that. And so I think it's, you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to be super strategic and proactive, but you do have to be willing to kind of be curious and kind of pick at new things to kind of try to figure out. And then you'd be surprised how that evolves your journey.
I think curiosity is 100% a skill and also an ingrained feature in entrepreneurs or founders or people who are willing to sort of adapt as things come. But it's also something I've learned that you kind of have to work at a little bit. You need to have the willingness and the persistence to improve yourself so you can get to the other side. You can actually learn the thing or do better at whatever opportunity has come along. I also think it's interesting as I've listened to you, you talk about risk, and I know you perceive yourself a little bit as risk adverse and very careful how you go about things. But How did you create that framework for your life? How did you decide as you grew in your career that no, I could take a little bit of risk, it just has to be calculated risk? How did you come up with that?
Yeah. So I remember my kind of first entrepreneurial job, right? So I was working in private equity at the time, and long hours, had gotten a little bit burned out, didn't know what the next thing was going to be, but had saved up some money, right? Post college was living at home for a number of years, right? My girlfriend at the time was joking that you know here I am, a private equity guy living with my parents, and she's living, has her own place, right? Not in private equity, but kind of creating that little bit of a base and a foundation, right? For me, it was financial driven, facilitated that. So as I was kind of thinking about what's next, it wasn't, oh, I need this income and I need to find this next job opportunity. It was like, okay, what I'm doing right now isn't perfect for me. I don't know what the next thing is going to be, but I know that I need to try something new. And okay, what's the plan? I'm going to give myself 18 months to find something new. And if I fail, then I know I'll have used up this much money. And what's it's always been what am I going to do if I fail, right? And what is getting comfortable with that if I fail scenario? Okay, if I fail, then 18 months later, 24 months later, I'll go back, find a job in private equity. My downside case is maybe I have lost 2 years of upward progression in private equity, right? And so once I got comfortable with that quote unquote worst case downside scenario, now it liberates you and really removes that worry and risk aversion side and really lets you focus on, okay, great, what's interesting, where can I get involved, and what opportunities can I take on? So I think, as an individual, you kind of have to learn who you are, right? Are you that risk taker, 5%er, shoot from the hip, risk it all, and you can perform under that? Or, are you more of a conservative, you get overwhelmed by such a huge risk, and then it becomes okay, look, what is my downside scenario? And is that is that workable? And if it is, then that kind of, I think, helps open you up to figuring out new things to try and give yourself a chance at that, entrepreneurial side.
I think that's an interesting way to go about it, because I think a lot of people view change as inherently risky, and it's why they won't do it. And it could be little change, right? Changing the software they use every day versus job change. But if you break it down into steps, into how you can approach it and how you can reduce some of that risk, it opens up your frame of reference of your willingness to do something. And I think that's a really great insight you have, that you can be entrepreneurial, you can make change in your life without taking on huge, crazy risk, as long as you plan accordingly. Is that what led you from GE to private equity, or was private equity just a natural progression out of GE?
Yeah. Um, so after GE, a couple of years there, had eaten my slice of humble pie and had seen that I'm not necessarily the best one out of the 40-person class. But GE was interesting because I had 4 jobs in a 2-year period. Some of the jobs I did really well, and some of them I was kind of definitely, a very long list of development opportunities. And in looking at myself, I was like, I've been the same person in all of these 4 jobs. It's not like, oh, I worked super hard here and I did really well and I just mailed it in and that's why. So it was I started to appreciate the human aspect and the interrelationship and the right, being the right fit, right? And making sure that you're in the right situation fit. And so as I was kind of wrapping up the GE 2-year program, I started kind of thinking about that. Okay, based on my experiences here and what's worked, what hasn't, is this the right fit for me? Is who I am going to be more successful here? And I found myself questioning that. And so that's what initially started me to kind of look for other opportunities. And so actually, I didn't go from GE to private equity immediately. I went to Deloitte Consulting first. And so that was kind of, okay, look, I've had some success here, but there have been some challenges here. Yeah, I think I want to see something else outside of GE, to see what that dynamic would be. Because GE was known for having, what they call GE lifers, right? And certainly when you're there, it's, hey, why would you want to go anywhere else? You're just taking a step down, right? This is back in the heyday of Jack Welch, GE days. And so for me, I just want to kind of see that for myself, and an opportunity with Deloitte Consulting in finance came up. And so made the decision to go to Deloitte. The grass was not greener on the other side. So it was a different learning experience. And again, worked with a lot of different folks and enjoyed the travel aspect of it, but found myself actually missing some of the business in-depth side of what I had at GE. And so that's where private equity first surfaced, was when I was at Deloitte, had still maintained relationships with a lot of the GE folks that I met. And I remember one of them was like, hey, you should look into private equity. I'm like, what is private equity? Right? I had no idea. I didn't go to a top tier school. There was no investment banking jobs or recruiters, from Temple when I was there. So I didn't know private equity at all. So I just literally started researching and Googling. And the more I learned, I was kind of, oh, this is interesting. This kind of leverages both the financial business side of things, but it's also at a higher level where you're not just, 18 levels down on the totem pole. So had kind of got intrigued enough and had set my sights on, I'm going to make this transition into private equity. And so that was almost a little bit of an entrepreneurial type of jump, because I was certainly not qualified, right? And didn't have the network, didn't have the connections, didn't have the pedigree, right, to get into private equity. And I remember, going on my first, well, not even going on my first interview, just emailing and trying to reach out different places, and finally someone even wanted to talk to me, right? It took me a long time just to get someone on the phone, and completely bombing the interview. I didn't know anything that they were asking, but coming away from that interview, I was like, okay, here's 7 things. I have no idea what they were talking about. How do I figure this out? And so now learned some of those things. And the next interview, bombed it again, right? But now I only didn't know 3 things. And so after doing this 5, 10, almost 15 times, I think, if I go back, I think I had 15 interviews or conversations, eventually found a firm that was looking for, more of a non-traditional background, wasn't necessarily looking just strictly at investment banking or previous private equity experience. It was looking more from an operator perspective, and kind of leveraging the knowledge that I had learned from the other interviews. I was able to do enough to, make them confident that I knew the core skill set, but also had this differentiated consulting and corporate finance background. And so landed my first job in private equity with Rourke Capital, which is an amazing firm and has done such amazing things back in Atlanta. And they took a chance on me. So it was definitely kind of something that started as an idea that once again came from someone else that was just random, that then kind of evolved into this kind of goal and mission. And through enough trial and error, was able to land my first private equity job.
Again, though, a thread along the lots of people have ideas, hear things, and do nothing with them. It takes effort to go bomb interviews and learn from them and improve yourself so that you can try to get where you want to go. I think that is something people need to remember, which is almost nobody's perfect, right? I don't know anybody who is. And if you focus on improving yourself, you're going to do pretty well. And I think that's really important.
That you said earlier, break it up into small pieces, because it's very easy to sit here and say, oh, I know nothing about private equity. How am I ever going to get into private equity? And that's a totally logical thing to say, right? But if you start breaking it up into little pieces, okay, I'm not trying to land a job in private equity. I'm just trying to have someone have a conversation with me, right? How do I have a conversation? Okay, now all of a sudden, okay, now you had that conversation, you learned something. And you've gone through 8 pieces, and now all of a sudden it's achievable rather than just this abstract, big concept, big idea. And I think that a lot of times you hear these amazing entrepreneur stories and these amazing founders that have built these amazing things. And certainly there's, again, the very small percentage of folks that just are, pioneers and visionaries and just, but I think what you hear more often is someone had an idea, they tried something, it didn't work. They tried something else, that didn't work. They tried a third thing. Oh, they had some success. It was in a different space than what they originally thought about. And again, 10 steps later, all of a sudden now they have something that works and functions and grows into things. So I do think that being curious is a big part of that, right? And just taking the first step, right? Rather than just shutting down an idea because it's too abstract or it seems too much to get done.
If you want to continue building your entrepreneurial mindset and enjoy our content, we would love for you to subscribe, hit the bell, follow along. You can also find us on our Substack, PossibLaw. Abrazos. There's two pieces to that. One is that pretty much nobody is where they are based on that instance, right? It's not like they turned on an idea and then sold it for $2 billion. Like there's a whole journey of how they got there that people have to remember. But the other thing that I think is interesting there is people who act. There's this thing that's a running thread through a lot of people I talk to, this idea of being a doer or an operator or a willingness to move forward that not everybody has. Lots of people come up with an idea or they want to get into something and they think they need to spend 40 years learning something or go back to school or an endless list of things before they're ready. And then there's another version of people who break it down and just start acting, right? Maybe I'll get it wrong the first time. Maybe I'll get it wrong the 50th time. I'm just going to start moving forward. How do you find that drive? I think it's such a unique thing as I talk to more and more people.
So it's interesting because a couple of times I found myself trying to boil the ocean, right? Especially I remember I had left WebEyeCare, which was my first entrepreneurial thing, and I had identified that I want to get into the pet space. And I spent, I think, like 4, 5, 6 months. I had knowledge, so I'm like, okay, I'm going to build all these amazing things day one before I start anything, right? And so kind of was researching, spent 6 months kind of gathering information, gathering the data, gathering the input and then eventually I'm like, look, 6 months have gone by. Sure, I have a larger PowerPoint presentation than I had when I started, but I've done nothing, right? And then it was kind of doing a complete 180. It's like, okay, you know what? I don't have the full strategy and the vision and how it's going to succeed, but I'm going to start building the website, right? I'm just going to start. I don't know. Just going to start today building this website. I don't need the full, 10-year strategy plan. And so I think sometimes for me, at least, it's been my initial instinct is to start building. Okay, you have to know everything. You have to figure it out. How are you going to make sales? Where are you going to get product? How are you going to scale it? Who are you going to hire? And then that quickly becomes overwhelming, and you just find yourself, caught in it. Versus, you know what? Okay, yes, I know I have to figure all those things out, but I'm just going to start. Just pick something and just start doing it. And then it's crazy how it evolves. And sure enough, you learn something there, a next step, and it never goes how you would have built it out in your strategic, long-term plan anyway. So I think that for me, it's been kind of sometimes trying to do all of it and getting stuck on that part and not being fulfilled, and then just deciding, start with something. And I think I remember one developer that worked for me. He was very mindful and thoughtful and kind of very into kind of mental health as well as just work. And so I'd have conversations with him. And one of the things he said that has always stuck with me all these years is whenever you do something, you got to make sure that you balance your long, mid, and short term tasks, right? Because he's like, if you're working on something that's long term, that's going to take 2 years to get launched, you're going to fade out, right? You're not going to have that personal fortitude to kind of continue and stay focused. Like, you can continue to work on that long-term thing, but you better make sure that you've got lots of short-term quick wins along the way that you can kind of check off your list to feel accomplished. So it's like, for him, that meant, he was working on this big system change that we needed that was going to take a long time, but then he also needed to make sure that he had, a fair amount of bug fixes and a fair amount of quick functionality enhancements that he was also working on, so that he could kind of, again, check off the boxes. Hey, here's the things I got done this month or this quarter. Here's the difference that it made, while at the same time working on this long-term deliverable. So same thing for me. I think that's the right balance there, is, making sure that, you've got those kind of short-term self-rewarding things along the way that kind of keep you motivated, help you feel good about what you're doing, help you feel successful, that then ultimately facilitate you staying the course over the long term.
Let's focus on private equity for a little bit, because I know it's been a big part of your career and how you kind of got where you are now. And it was something that somebody just suggested and you had no experience with. And so I think anybody who's listening here who maybe doesn't know and understand what private equity is, I'd love to give them a little bit of background. At a high level, where does private equity play in, our economy and jobs and companies?
Sure. So, at the very core basic level, what private equity is a firm that raises money from investors. So they have a pool of money, and sometimes investors will want to invest in stocks in the stock market, and other times they want to invest in private companies, right? And so we raise a pool of money, and then we go out and look for opportunities to buy, sometimes 100%, sometimes a majority of a private company. And then ultimately, what we're looking to do is to grow that company via a variety of ways, and then within a defined time period, essentially sell that company for ideally more money than what we bought it, and it creates a return for our investors. So at a very core level, it's very much like, the easiest analogy is always real estate, right? You buy a house, you improve the house, and then you rent it out for a while, you get some rental income from it, and then eventually you sell it, right? And so it's a very kind of similar, only instead of a house, it's a company. And so private equity really is involved in all aspects. Now, obviously, there's 1,000 different flavors of private equity, and kind of, but at the core, that's what it ultimately is. And so for me, what was super attractive is, well, first of all, usually these are smaller companies that are, it's not tens of thousands of people organization that you can't wrap your heads around. A lot of times it's 50 to 100 total employees that work for the company. So you can kind of get an understanding of all the different dynamics of a business. There's also exposure to the different folks that are running the business, and you can have a pretty direct, frank conversation with them. And so those are kind of the things that, attracted me to private equity, and some of the things that I learned. And also it kind of starts to demystify the whole enigma of what it means to be a founder, or what it means to be a CEO, because it's just people, right? And so, as I was in private equity, one of the most amazing things about it is, when you're looking to buy a company, first you kind of analyze, you'll get a presentation, right, or a flyer, and you can review those materials, but eventually you get a meeting with management, right? And so kind of the private equity firm goes, and it's usually a 2, 3, 4 hour meeting with management, where they present their business, and then you can ask questions. If you're buying 1 or 2 companies a year, you might go to 30 or 40 of these management presentations. So you see a lot, you meet a lot of different folks that are all pitching their business to be sold to you. And they tell you about themselves and whatnot. And again, it starts to cut it up into little pieces. Like it's not some enigma, amazing person who just had a 1 in a million idea. It's like, hey, this is person, smart, motivated, good leader, but you can start to say, okay, I could maybe do that, or at least for a subset, maybe out of those 30 people, there were 10 that are like, oh, this person thinks just like I think. I could definitely be this kind of person. So, so for me, that was a big self growth and a confidence growth is just as part of my job, meeting a lot of folks. I was always fascinated in the story of how they built it, where did they have the idea, and things of that sort. And then just seeing enough folks that kind of come from a similar mindset or background or whatnot as me, and seeing that they were able to do it, reinforced in my mind, okay, this is something that maybe one day I could do.
That operator bug or that founder bug that you got out of those experiences, is that what led you to WebEyeCare?
Basically, so I remember at Rourke, we looked at acquiring an e-commerce company, and Rourke was very operationally focused. And they had an operating partner who was a successful e-commerce entrepreneur, who, again, if you take a step back and you think, oh my God, this guy is just a visionary revolution, but I was the junior guy, right? So anything that he wanted to get done, I had to do over many long nights. And so then just by being his kind of junior analyst, essentially, to kind of do all the analysis, I got a peek into how he looks at these e-commerce businesses. And it was no longer it's like, hey, it's very mathematical. It's very numbers driven. It's not big idea, big picture. It's numbers and execution against those, tactical numbers. And so when I was looking to, try something for myself, right, I kept kind of going back to that numbers driven. I need to find some opportunity that is more of a numbers driven game than a people and relationship driven game, right? I'm not going to go in here and negotiate all these amazing contracts and whatnot. It's like, no, I need something where it's math and numbers and analytical driven, where I know if I can get the numbers right, we can succeed. And so e-commerce was something that during that work experience, I had a huge appreciation for and learned a ton just from being the junior person, that, that combined with meeting these, founders, that I said, okay, I don't know all the details, but I think I could do something here. And so, between living at home with the parents and saving up some money and kind of having an entrepreneurial itch to scratch, plus that early e-commerce experience, when I had left private equity and was looking for some entrepreneurial pursuit to do, that's where WebEyeCare kind of started. As a family member, was an optometrist and had an idea and a concept for an online retailer of contact lenses and glasses, and it was very early days, and so it's kind of like, hey, look, if you're interested, come on board and try to help us figure this out. And again, it was a perfect opportunity for me to. I didn't have it all figured out. I didn't know anything about the optical industry. I don't wear glasses or contact lenses. I didn't have any relationships in there, but it was like, okay, look, I know that this is numbers and math and digital marketing and customer acquisition driven. So I don't have a huge disadvantage against someone else. And so it's like, hey, let's come on board. Let's start learning. Let's start trial and error and trying to figure things out.
How long were you at WebEyeCare?
I was there roughly 5 years. And I remember, when it started, it was in the back of an optometry office, right? My cousin and his wife, they had an optometry practice, and in the back is where they kind of did the website operation. So in the early days, it was working in the back of an optometry office, the only employee, basically, and kind of doing every role, things that I maybe knew about and things that I had no idea about, but just you have to do it and just try it and learn along the way. And so kind of went from zero or one or just myself to hiring, having the first time ever to hire an employee and figure out what that meant. Did not go well the first hire, but eventually, after a couple of trial and errors, you figure out what it means to hire folks and manage folks. Um, and over many years, the first couple of years were slow and difficult, but then just by putting yourself in that position, a couple of things go right. You learn a couple of things. You figure out a few things, and next thing it's step function. And we were able to have a lot of success and kind of scale that business, organically, and somewhat rapidly. So did that for 5 years.
And it's something you and I have talked about, this, I guess, difference between founding companies, like starting from an idea from zero versus coming in and running a company. And we'll talk about the latter a little bit more with Alivet in a minute, but it seems to me WebEyeCare was much more that founder role, right? I mean, doing everything and like kind of figuring it out as you go, even if somebody else came up with the idea. I'm just curious, you've been in both roles, right? Sort of more of the professional CEO coming in versus the founder do everything role. Do you think founders grow into the professional CEO? Is that something that you do need to bring in as the company scales? What do you think about that?
Yeah, and we can certainly talk about it more when we talk about Alivet in a minute, but it's interesting. It's different skill sets, right? Where as a doer, you just, hey, customer service, how do you do customer service? Okay, great. Digital marketing, how do you do digital marketing? Great. Trial and error, figure it out, just dive in. But ultimately, your capacity constraint there, right? So even if you're the best digital marketer and no one's going to do it as good as you, if you just stay in that digital marketing role, because that's quote unquote how you can add the most value to the organization, there's a natural limiter on what the organization can do. And so I think that as part of that quote unquote founder journey, you have to learn and develop, and you learn it organically, because it's just like, hey, I spent the last year doing the same thing and we actually didn't grow, right? It's like, I was working really hard and I think I was doing a good job, but we haven't grown. Why haven't we grown? It's like, well, because nothing else has been done, right? And we've just spent all our time here. So it becomes, okay, and then you make your first hire and it's like, oh, they're not doing it as good as I did it, right? So that's a mistake. So your initial reaction is like to double down, and it reinforces that you need to go back in there. Well, first of all, you've probably been doing it for 5 years at that point, and new person's coming in, so you forget about all the mistakes you made in the early days. But ultimately, it's like, look, you need to understand that even if someone that you hire isn't doing it as good as you, but they do it at 90%, and you've got 3-4 folks that are doing something at 90% of what, again, because you're overconfident, you think that you do best, that's a much better outcome than if you were doing it yourself. And so it kind of becomes a natural evolution in my mind of that role. Now, when I got into larger roles and with Alivet, we definitely had a mixture of folks that we hired. And, there's a different background where, again, I would call it a professional manager, right? Someone that, especially folks that come from larger organizations, right? Where they've been super successful and have accomplished a lot. And it's very easy to be impressed by that and think that, you're going to achieve it. And then for one reason or another, you don't get the same results. And what I learned there is it's, the details matter, right? It's like, hey, who was your boss? Well, what did they provide? Who were the people that worked for you? What did they provide? Did you succeed because you were in the right place at the right time, and the people above you drove a lot of the stuff, and you had a great team underneath you that you inherited? Or did you succeed because you were able to build that team underneath you and you were able to get the most out of them and effectively manage them? And so again, and those details matter, right? Because There's definitely plenty of super successful folks that take another job and the success doesn't carry over. And so I think it's both. That doer mentality, a lot of times they struggle with a bigger team and they're very good one-on-one, but they struggle in a team environment and you're limited there. And vice versa. The person that thrives in a team and culture and building environment sometimes doesn't achieve the same result because they don't have that doer mentality. And so in private equity, in the roles that I've had as an operator, that's always kind of the challenge, is because you need both and you need a mix of both. And so I think it's important to identify what's most important. Are you at the level where you can afford to have the support level team? And you need someone that can just bring all the pieces together and manage them, or are you at a more tactical doer side? Um, and then you have folks that kind of start one place and get to the other place. So it's a bit of a mix. I've certainly had. I find I get along best and have the most commonality and have gotten the best success out of the person that, as I call it, the unpolished rocks, because I myself was an unpolished rock. But again, that's still a development area for me. And when I talk to successful folks that are kind of, again, professional leaders, I often find their views interesting and things that I don't have that capability, right? So part of my gravitation toward the doers just because of what I know. And I think part of my future journey as I meet more folks, I'm always trying to understand better how do you succeed without being the doer, right? And learning that.
I think what you've said is spot on. I think the only add-on I would say is that there are a subset of people who have the skill set to be leadership managers, right? Use leverage of other people to do work and still manage, but are still kind of that founder mentality. When they need to, they will get in the weeds. They will do whatever they need to get done, and they act. They don't just sit behind. And a lot of people that come up through very large organizations, they've had so many resources around them kind of the whole time that they lack that ability to just go do stuff, right? You tell them, hey, we need help over here, and they're like, wait, I don't understand. That's not my job. And you're like, there's like 9 of us here. I don't know what to tell you, right? Yeah. And so figuring that balance out, I agree, is important, but I think there are people that can do both, and that seems to be a superpower for smaller organizations. And finding those people is important.
I have maybe a different view on that. So I remember when I was at
Give it.
Milestone, which was a private equity firm, and one of our portfolio companies, we had a CEO who, at the board meetings, like, he's the player coach, he's the doer. Whenever there's a problem, he gets it done. And we were like, oh, we'd come away from those meetings and be like, oh, this is this is exactly who we need, right? And then later he ended up leaving the organization and we had someone else in. And I remember we had a conversation like, oh man, remember that guy? He was really good. He would just get stuff done. He's like, he was terrible. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, yeah, he would get stuff done because the whole organization would come to a grinding halt and work on whatever it is that was his priority. And sure, if you're doing a call center migration or implementation and it's not going well and you take everyone off their job and the sole focus of the entire organization is just call center migration, yeah, you had a great call center. Yeah, it was off the racks and now it's fully done. But oh, by the way, all the other stuff got dropped in the interim. So I think a lot of times, so while yes, I do agree that ultimately you want that total player coach, you got to be careful of kind of acknowledging that, especially when a leader creates a priority and then is able to get it done or is able to fix problems, that they're not just doing it because they suck up all the resources of an organization, and they're doing it the right way while continuing to move the organization forward. And so that's always been kind of something in the back of my mind where, yes, I'm available and I love I personally love rolling my sleeves up and digging in. Um, but I always kind of try to make sure that I'm cognizant of the broader implications and that, we got the right resources and priorities. And just because I'm working on something doesn't mean that's the whole thing the company's doing, right? The other parts need to still continue.
I think that's it's an amazing insight, a critical insight, that when you want people to do an act, they can't then take all the resources of the entire organization to get that thing done. I think a lot of founders get stuck in that, right? They're the leader. I'm going to do something. It's my priority. I want the resources, move forward. And if you look at it on the opposite side, the sort of professional manager gets stuck sometimes in the I'm a delegator. I help facilitate, when you need a little bit of both, is what I hear you say. And the reason I ask about it is I think we're seeing this accelerate over the last 18 months in the age of AI and whatever you want to call it, which is much flatter organizations, less managers, less delegators, more people, individual contributors doing things. And it's a thread I've been talking to with people about how do you get there? Because organizations are reorganizing right now around this flatter org, and you're having people that were managers moving to individual contributors, and they're a little stuck. They're not exactly sure what to do, right? They're in this world of like, well, what do I do? And they're like, you go sell something or go do a finance spreadsheet or whatever it is. So how do you think that will, equate to this new world we're in?
It's interesting. My brother's in technology, and so obviously folks that are in technology get influences by this. Maybe they're on the early edge of this, right? Someone that's in marketing or customer service or operations is still impacting and thinking through this, but yeah, they're in this day and age, a couple of weeks or months behind, not a couple of quarters or years, but and it's something that he's voiced to me. His concern is like, look, I'm a professional manager at this point. I used to do stuff, but now I manage people, and I think that the future is going to be, you don't need managers, you just need doers, right? AI will facilitate that. I think that yes. So if you're purely just a manager and a delegator, there's a chance that you become too far removed from the implementation. But I think again, maybe it's just because it's a continuing learning for me. The whole delegation, like I continue to prioritize that, right? Because it's just a shortcoming that I've had. And so I think that yes, there's AI tools and there's a need for, again, being more of a player coach. But I think as organizations grow and scale, you still need to be able to rely on others to accomplish it, right? Again, just having myself been there multiple times, where I remember in the early days of Alivet, right, there was some customer service and workflows that I kind of, it's super fun to work on. You can rearrange them, and I worked on them, and I worked closely with the person that was in charge of that. And at the end, I felt great. It took us like a month and a half, and like I could show with KPIs the improvements that we made and the efficiency gains that we got, and the average person could now do 50% more than what they could do before. So I felt amazing, right? It was really great. But then it's like, but yeah, I spent a month and a half on this, and oh, by the way, we had a bad month on marketing. Because I didn't spend time on that, and sure, there's someone that's working on that, but I didn't give it enough focus. And so it's kind of like, look, yes, I saved a few pennies, as you call it, but I may have missed some dollars. And so I think that that could actually be a concern. Hey, you have AI, and AI can do everything for you, and so I don't need other folks. But I think that you still need to kind of have you need to have enough knowledge of the individual pieces so that you can intelligently guide and you're not just project managing something, right? But I still think that, within an organization, that coach mentality is really important. And that's who ultimately wins. It's because the other thing I found is in, the difference between success and failure is not hitting a grand slam. It's, hitting 20 singles along the way, right? And the companies, whether it's in private equity or even mine, when you kind of look back, it's like, oh, there wasn't like one big idea that someone had that resulted in this amazing outcome. It's like, no, like I can't really point to one big thing, but it was successful and they did a great job. And it's like, yes, because they did enough little things, and next thing you know, your fulfillment cost is less than your competitors, or you did enough things on the marketing or conversion or UX UI optimization, and next thing you know, your acquisition cost is less. And it's like, okay, now you combine the lower acquisition cost with the lower fulfillment cost, and all of a sudden you have a competitive advantage that doesn't seem so straightforward, but results in the outcome. So I think that, ultimately, you have to kind of have done it before potentially, or have been curious enough before, to understand something, but then ultimately to truly be successful, you need to figure out how can you best support the right people in the right roles so that they can do those things, and it's not as reliant on the individual contribution part and more on the guidance and advisory and leadership part of it.
I think even with AI for the foreseeable future, people matter. People are always going to matter. And how you leverage the people around you, your skill sets, and of course, software and the rest of it is going to make a big difference on your ability to succeed. Let's talk about Alivet for a little bit, because it's a big part of your story. You left WebEyeCare. You spent months in a coffee shop trying to figure out what to buy, right? How to get it. You locate Alivet, and you eventually work to acquire it so that you can start running it, right?
Yep. So, WebEyeCare did it for a bunch of years, had some success, ultimately exited that business without the next thing figured out, right? But part of that decision was the same thing as my decision to leave private equity and try something entrepreneurial, right? Hey, what's my downside scenario? Yeah, at this point, I wasn't living with my parents anymore, so I guess
You had
that
moved up. Good
yeah, I moved
job.
up. I moved out of the house, but it was hey, what's my downside scenario? Am I comfortable with that? How much time am I giving myself to figure out the next thing? And if it doesn't work, what am I going to do? So I checked all those things off the box and had a playbook there. So now I was like, okay, I've got this private equity experience. I've got this e-commerce experience. Um, uh, you know, what should I do next? Right. And very fortuitous, right? I had uh, gotten a dog with my wife, and we took him to the veterinarian, and was completely unaware of anything pet medicine industry, but it was a very similar experience in that, um, the in the optical space, you go to optometrist, and because of the industry, the optometrist also sells products, right? So it's a medical professional that also is engaged in retail, and in the pet space, right? Your veterinarian, um, also carries and sells the medicine. And so I had kind of, okay, well, that's interesting. There's definitely a similarity there. Again, didn't know anything about pet space, didn't know anything, pet medicine, none of those things, but just had kind of had this organic experience and started being curious. Okay, so let me be curious about what to do. Um, and so that's when I started kind of creating that PowerPoint that we talked about, right? And I spent, yeah, okay, so there's pet medicine, but there's more than pet medicine. There's pet food. Obviously, that's a nice recurring. Chewy was not massive yet at that time. Chewy was still, this would have been back in um, 2015. So at that point, Chewy had had already started down the path, but it wasn't huge. So again, I was just curious. Had to buy dog food for my pet. So I went online, Google searching, found some website that was cheaper. Um, Again, curious, like rather than just I placed the order, but I was also like, let me Google this website. Who runs this website? Sure enough, came across some random individual and kind of reached out and spoke to him. Just again, hey, I'm so and so, I'm a customer. Nice to meet you, right? Nothing came from that conversation. Was just a random one-off thing. Um, Continued down. I'll revisit that in a minute, but continued down my path and journey, just researching. Eventually said, okay, you know what? I'm researching too much. Need to start building. Right? Went online, bought a domain name. Started a e-commerce site, hired a developer offshore for $15 an hour to start building. Again, don't know how I'm going to get revenue, don't have investors, just have a little pot of money to just start building. But I knew that there was something to this pet medicine side of the equation. And so I was like, okay, well, we did contact lenses, right? There's got to be distributors. And so I started kind of trying to figure out how we're going to have, pet medicine, but quickly learned there's more stringent regulatory requirements around pet medicine than there is around contact lenses. And so I was like, okay, well, I don't have the money day one to have a pharmacy. So I need someone else to do the pharmacy for me, right? So just, again, simple as that. Was already building the website. Next thing is, figure out the pharmacy. So, hey, who can do maybe fulfillment for me? So came across a couple different sites, smaller, hey, I'm so-and-so. So now it's not like, hey, I'm so-and-so researching. It's, hey, I'm so-and-so. I'm building this site, right? This is what the name of the site is. I'm interested in talking to you about pet medicine fulfillment. And so again, that's a much different conversation, right? If I had just said I'm researching, they probably wouldn't have talked to me. But because I had more of a purpose, was able to engage. Ultimately, I remember I called Alivet customer service. Can I speak with your business development manager? Right? Oh. And like the customer service representative was like confused, like, okay, let me transfer you, right? And so they transferred me to their quote unquote business development manager. And, I kind of say, hey, give my whole spiel, looking to build a site, curious if you could do fulfillment. And the individual's like, yeah, I could do it. You'll have a lot of hurdles, blah, blah, blah. And then toward the end of the conversation, like, oh, by the way, like, what's your title? What's your role there? He's like, oh, I'm the owner. Oh, you're the owner. Sure enough, he was the owner, he was the finance, he was the marketing, he was the business development, right? It was kind of a bunch of customer service folks and the owner. So in that random conversation, right, wasn't calling to buy his company. He said, hey, by the way, I have a private equity background. Have you ever thought of selling your business? Just completely. And he's like, yeah, I'm open. I'm always open to talking. So again, completely random. Wasn't why I called. Wasn't part of the plan. And then sure enough, kind of that one little step led to the next step of, okay, well, look, leveraging my private equity days, in order for me to put an offer in front of you, I would need some additional information. Let's sign a confidentiality agreement, and I'll give you a request list and things of that sort. Again, disregard the fact that I definitely don't have the money to do this, right? Zero thought from that. I'm like, well, look, that's a good problem to have, right? If the only problem I have is I don't have the money, I'll worry about that when the time comes. And so, what started as just kind of a partnership outreach, what started as me building this website and just looking to fill in some puzzle pieces, ended up transitioning into, hey, thanks for sending me your financials. Here's what I think it's worth. Just completely not made up, but just based off of my previous private equity career and how we evaluated companies. Now I was the junior guy there. Now I'm the only guy. And so put a number in front of the individual. He's like, okay, yeah, that sounds fair. Which I wasn't expecting to hear. And so then at that point I was like, okay, well, look, I need, 90 days to find the capital to do this deal. He's like, okay, and for him, he's become a great friend and I've known him. So I've replayed the story with him in hindsight. And he's like, look, what do I care? There's no downside for me, right? You were trustworthy. I didn't think you were going to steal my data or anything of that sort. So, you know, he had actually thought about selling before, and he had gotten a lower offer previously than what I didn't know any of this, right? So maybe it was kind of a little bit. I thought it was a good deal, but turns out it was a good deal, but it was more than what he had previously gotten, which is why he was also interested in it. But in any case, so ultimately signed up with him. So now it's like, okay, now I have a signed agreement to acquire a company, and I've got 90 days to do it. Who am I going to call? I don't know anyone with this kind of money. I don't have these kind of relationships. So well, let me search. Turns out there's a whole segment of the industry where there's financial institutions that they are there, or their primary strategy is to support kind of one-off entrepreneurs or founders or deal guys, whatever it is, that have a quote unquote proprietary deal, right? This wasn't a deal where it was marketed and it was an auction and the highest price wins. This is something that I built a relationship and was able to, through my relationship, sign up outside of it. And so what initially, again, if I would have thought about it in advance, I would have never gone down. Now was cutting into pieces was I found, oh, well, I can have a whole bunch of conversations. So I just made a list of all these different firms and started dialing for dollars, right? These weren't folks that I knew. Maybe the first conversation didn't go well. They're like, who are you? Why are you calling? Etc. But eventually you had a couple conversations and maybe some no's. And then from there, every time I get a no, I'm like, oh, is there anyone else that you could maybe, that this might be a fit for? The next thing you know, that introduction, now it's no longer who's this random individual calling me. Now it's, oh, Sal introduced me. So now I'm still a random individual, but and I don't know Sal. I cold called Sal. But now because it's going through Sal, it's like, oh, well, he knows Sal. He must be someone. And now you get the time of day. So did that process, ended up surprisingly, having several folks that were interested in supporting me. And I remember also being super scared because Alivet was a couple times bigger than WebEyeCare. I was like, this is all going to come rattling down. Sure, at this point, they're okay. But the minute they learned how big WebEyeCare was, like, that's it, right? Why would they trust someone that had a business a third the size? And to my surprise, all of these, backers were okay. And I think part of it, as I've come to appreciate, is like, look, ultimately, if I needed to be replaced, they were taking that risk that they can replace me with someone else, right? So ultimately, it was more about the opportunity and the deal. But in any case, so the website that I was building completely fell by the wayside, right? That's no longer, so the quote unquote 3-4 months that I spent building it were a little bit of a waste, you could say. But frankly, without doing that, I would have never gotten to this point, right? So it's not a waste. It was the best money or time ever spent. And then ultimately that resulted in, finding the right backer, working together to do all the due diligence, and then the deal closed. And I, as a founder, he had, a bunch of employees that reported to him. He wanted to transition out, and so I moved down from Philadelphia to Miami to run the business, post closing. So now all of a sudden, I went from running a smaller organization to running a much larger organization, and you have to just figure it out, right? And so now it's okay. The deal's done. That's great, amazing. Not sure how I could have ever fallen into this path, but what now? And how do we build it and grow from here? So that was kind of the Alivet journey. Again, not a bold move, not a visionary, not a think outside the box type of thing, but more of a tactical.
I think what is so inspiring about that story is it just was hard work and smarts and being curious and willing to learn and willing to try. And I think at the end of the day, anybody can do that if they put their mind to it. And that is something that is inspiring for anybody listening today. How long were you at Alivet?
So I ran Alivet for 4 years. So from 2017 to 21. And then part of my kind of learning and journey, right? Again, talking about learning that you can't just be a doer, right? I had built this great team of folks that kind of were doers, and we accomplished a lot in a one-on-one setting. But I found myself more and more struggling with, I would always say, 1 + 1 is not equaling 3, right? So if it was a me and someone else working on a project, we had a lot. But the minute that it was, 3, 4 people working or cross-functional collaboration needed, I was struggling, right? And I was going with my doer mentality in there, and it wasn't that helpful. And I wasn't frankly enjoying it as much, right? I wasn't as successful, I wasn't as good, I wasn't enjoying it as much, and I was struggling with it. And that kind of made me take a step back and say, okay, based on where the business is now, am I the best leader to run it going forward? That was a difficult introspection or decision or kind of thought to the private equity folks, the private equity backers that supported me in doing this deal. The company had done well, and so if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? So there wasn't any pressure from that level of, hey, Peter, you need to find someone else. So it was me saying, look, as a minority owner and as the person in the trenches, I think I need to find someone else to kind of come in and someone that I can learn from to some extent. I'll continue to support it. I'm still heavily invested in the success of this business, but how do I find someone that can build this organization? So again, going back to the whole networking and things happen, many years later for crazy reasons. So we did a CEO search. We had spoken to a lot of different candidates. We had some false starts along the way. And so just, the ultimate candidate that we brought in was just someone that I had met 10 years previous in a previous relationship under completely different circumstances.
You never know what's going to come out of a conversation, an email, an answer, a meeting. That's fantastic. And you recently exited out of Alivet, correct?
Yeah. So again, I transitioned out back in 2021, but again, stayed involved at the board level. And Alivet at the end of last year, after I guess 7.5, 8 years, was sold to actually Tractor Supply, which we had a white label partnership with them, right? And they decided that this is an area they wanted to invest in and kind of go all in, and they decided that it was better to acquire than partner. But again, if you think about it all these years later, right, kind of one step to the next, without the WebEyeCare experience, without trying to sell WebEyeCare, without the investment banker introducing us to FSA Store, without that initial white label partnership, without bringing on the CEO many years later at Alivet, without creating the white label partnership strategy, right? So it's just, I think, that's been my kind of main path of my journey is you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to be a visionary. You got to be curious. You got to put yourself in a position where you can take measured risks with an open mind and without a, fear of failure mentality that handicaps you. And then just, put yourself in a position, and you'll have many failures along the way and many things that don't work out, but eventually, one puzzle piece leads to another, and kind of navigate forward and can have some success.
And now you've gone all the way from GE through this entrepreneurial journey, and you've been recently appointed a director for a publicly traded company. Kind of a wild trajectory. How does that feel?
Yeah. Again, another interesting step, right? I never in a million years would say, hey, I'm going to be on a public company board. It wasn't something that I was in my strategy or in my vision to do at all. And if I something that I would have even assigned as a goal at a high level, it would have been like, oh, well, I'm definitely not fit or qualified. I don't even know where I would begin. Again, being curious, being open, to relationships, right? And dialogues. I had, met some folks along the way, and had dialogues. It's only been a couple months at this point, but been super interesting, learning a new thing while being rewarding and being able to add value. And who knows? We might be talking in 5-10 years from now, and I might be telling you a story of how this public company board role and the relationships that I made and just kind of being there evolves into the next thing. So it's kind of a continuation of a lot of the same things from before. I tell you what was really cool. Again, my dad, who obviously, why can't you just get a real job? He definitely enjoyed seeing the press release, and because when you join a public company board, it's a press release. And he definitely enjoyed seeing my name in a quote unquote, press release, which in his mind obviously is it's as if we're on front page of CNN or something of that sort. But it was kind of fun to kind of get that reaction from him.
It only took all this time for you to actually do something right, Peter.
That's
Good
right.
job.
That's right.
It's funny how the things that make your parents happy, you're like, what about everything else? No, I like the press release. The press release is good. As we close out our podcasts, I always like to ask our guests, what do you want the audience to take away from today? Any guidance, mantras?
Yeah. I think the one thing that I've done well, or that I've, I guess, appreciated about my journey in hindsight, is this kind of risk averse or risk adjusted path to entrepreneurship, right? I got lots of friends, from the outside, they all very similar theme of like, oh, that's amazing how you've done this. You're an entrepreneur or a risk taker, or just, I could never do that, right? Type of mindset. And the reality is, they're very similar to me, right? And so I think if there's, folks that are listening to this that are curious, right, is the right way to say it, but doubtful, right? Curious but doubtful. I think that my journey, at least, hopefully can be a little bit of a eye opener of, you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to be a huge visionary idea, professional networker, right? But if you're curious and genuine, and maybe live at home with your parents for a couple of years, to save up a couple of dollars, that will enable you to, take that first step. That you'd be surprised how things evolve over time and where you can get to.
I think that's great advice. Risk adjusted path to entrepreneurship. You should tag that and copyright it if you're on. Where can people follow along? LinkedIn? Do you have Instagram of your dogs everywhere? Where do you want people to follow along?
Yeah. I've not been a personal brand type of individual. You'll see my Instagram has zero posts, and I don't think I've ever posted on LinkedIn. But I think that as I take some time, I think that is one thing that I kind of want to focus in a little bit more on is, how do I be more thoughtful, not just about the things I work on, but, how I present myself out there so that, more, potential opportunities come across my desk versus them being just a natural fallout from the things that I do externally. So unfortunately, there's limited ways to follow along today, other than, maybe email you to be introduced to me.
Yeah.
Is probably the best.
I'll be your agent. You can just find me, and then you'll find Peter. All right. Thanks so much, Peter. I can't wait till we have the next conversation after you figure out what's next. Thanks so much for coming on.
Sal, thanks so much for putting this together. It's the first one of these kind of podcasts that I've ever done, so it's been fun to, think through my journey and try to see what aspects of it could be beneficial for others. So really enjoyed it.